Hey, my name's Brad, and I've been making games for over 6 years, and I now have over 20 games released on my itch page, with hundreds more that never made it that far. And while each of these games means something different to me, and taught me new skills and different techniques that I would use in later projects, I think that's a story best saved for another time. Today I want to focus on a project that's very special to me, as it was my first ever commercial release. The game I'm referring to is known as Infernal Elements. Now, leading up to recording this video, I spent a lot of time trying to decide what I actually want this video to be. At first, I thought I was just going to make a video where I showed off some funny bugs and cracked a bunch of jokes. But as I reviewed all the versions of the project and went back through the history start to end on what we had done, I realized that wasn't what I wanted. I realized what I want this video to be is a retrospective on the game development process. I want to really go back from start to end and look at Infernal Elements and decide what were things that I did well and what were things I could have done better. That way when I move on to future projects, I'll have something to look back on that'll tell me if I'm going in the right direction. And if you're a game developer working on your own projects, hopefully this video will show you a little bit of insight into my mistakes and maybe they'll help you avoid them. Or alternatively, maybe you'll find some tricks or interesting things that you can implement within your own games to make them better. And for everyone else, I hope you find the game development process as interesting as I do. I hope that you pick up on some little details that you never even considered a game developer having to deal with, or at the very least, get an understanding for all the work that goes into making all your favorite games. So now that I've explained my goal for the video, I think it's time that I get into what Infernal Elements actually is. For those of you who aren't already aware, Infernal Elements is a top-down, action-packed boss rush bullet hell. Or for those of you who have a bit more of a social life and maybe don't understand those words I just said, it's kind of like the pacing of Cuphead but with the gameplay of Enter the Gungeon. And for those of you with a bit more of a social life who don't know what both of those things are, it looks like this. So now that I've given you all the context, it's time we take a step back, way back, to August 30th, 2022. Me and my friend Joey had just started a call to talk about another game that I just finished for a game jam. And after we had finished that conversation, we got a little sidetracked. We started looking at old projects we had worked on, things we had worked on together even. And from there we started asking, why haven't we made a game and tried to put it on Steam yet? We've both been doing game development for quite a few years at that point, and it seemed like the next logical step to us. However, I should clarify that this wouldn't be the first time we had a conversation like this. In fact, this would be the third time that me and Joey had sat down and tried to come up with a game that we would ideally try to release on Steam. But what we didn't know at the time is that we would finally follow through on those ambitions and release something on Steam for the world to see. After agreeing that we were ready to work on a long-term project, the first question we had to figure out was, what kind of game do we want to make? To start, the only thing we knew is that we wanted to make the game fun. And while you may think that every game developer just wants to make a game that's fun, there's definitely games where this is easier than others. For example, when building out an action game or a platformer, I can usually get a pretty good feel for how fun the game's going to be, because most of the interesting aspects of those games come from the foundational mechanics, things like fighting, jumping, shooting, and so on. On the other hand, developing slower-paced games like puzzle games or card games can be a little more risky, as the more interesting and fun mechanics aren't necessarily shown right off the bat. Because of this, it might not be until much later into development you have a good understanding of how fun your game is and what changes need to be made. For example, if my goal is to build a turn-based card game, I would have to build features to shuffle the deck, deal the cards, look at my hands, and then play them before I could even begin to tell how fun the game is. Additionally, turn-based games usually have pretty interconnected systems, making it difficult to add and remove mechanics quickly. So with all of that in mind, we finally started looking back at all of our previous projects and tried to determine if any of them would be worth expanding on and trying to turn into a full-fledged Steam game. But after quickly determining that none of these would make very good candidates, we instead started looking at them trying to see if there were any patterns or mechanics that could potentially be used in a larger project. And it was during this process that we found that the mechanic that consistently stood out to us as the most memorable and fun were almost always the boss fights. Even on projects where the gameplay was really basic, it was well-designed bosses that allowed us to turn the simple mechanics into something really fun. Sticking with this idea of games primarily focused on boss fights, more traditionally known as a boss rush game, we started looking into examples that had done this really well in the past. After we started looking into it, we saw that there weren't exactly a whole ton of boss rush games already present on Steam. However, the most famous one by far is Cuphead. And while we would definitely use Cuphead for inspiration on some mechanics in Infernal Elements, the game that had by far the largest influence on our development is known as Fury. If you're not already aware, Fury is the most literal interpretation of a boss rush game. The only two things you'll be doing are fighting bosses and walking to the next arena. However, what sets Fury apart, well, ignoring the incredible soundtrack and aesthetic, is how intricate and well-designed each of the boss fights are. You'll be switching between a melee and ranged combat form and going from phase to phase, which will each dynamically change the fight. However, as you may be able to tell, me and Joey are not professionals. We're just two people doing this as a hobby, hoping to make something fun. Because of this, we know that we don't have the skills or the resources needed to create a game on the level of Fury, at least not visually. Because of this, we decided we wanted to find one more game to use as a visual guide. This led us to Enter the Gungeon. The reason we chose this game was because the top-down bullet hell gameplay matched what we wanted to make, and the low-density pixel art with advanced lighting was also something I had quite a bit of experience with at the time. So even though Infernal Elements would gradually evolve into something totally unique over its development period, these gameplay and visual references would give us a good target to try and replicate when we were still figuring things out in the beginning. So while it's true that the roots for Infernal Elements weren't the most original, I was never too afraid of being called a copy or a clone of these games, because if someone were comparing my game to something along the lines of Fury or Enter the Gungeon, I think that's actually something to be proud of rather than upset about. So now that we knew the kind of game we wanted to make, we decided we wanted to set a few ground rules. To start, we knew we wanted to make something that was interesting right away. This meant not bogging the player down with story details that they wouldn't care about, or trying to force them through a lengthy tutorial that takes them out of the action. The next point that we listed was that we wanted to make sure the player was always making decisions. And what we mean by this is we want to make sure there's no downtime where the player's not doing anything interesting. And while we later decided that it was better to have a little bit of downtime to break up the pacing of the game, I would say for the most part, we kept it to a minimum and it doesn't really take away from the action. And our last goal listed was to avoid any actions that might be seen as grinding. Now for the direction we took the final game in, there wasn't really any time to introduce mechanics like that, but I still felt that it was important to point this out early. As for the setting and story of the game, we initially came up with the idea that it would be about all the elemental demons from the underworld fighting to take control after the old king had grown old. And while later the story would be completely rewritten and we would start simply referring to all the characters as the elementals, the initial concept of all the characters being demonic can still be seen in many of their final designs, especially since most of the characters in the game have horns. And now finally, with a gameplay style, visual style, and story picked out, we were ready to begin development. Beginning development, we knew the first thing we wanted to work on was the player character, as getting the player character feeling good to move and control was very important, as everything else in the game would be balanced around that. And within just a few hours, Joey would send me the first concept art for what our main character could look like. And that's when I realized this was going to take a few tries. It was at this point that we went back to Enter the Gungeon and started using their characters as reference. However, I definitely chimed in and had a little bit of bias towards trying to give our character some kind of robe with a hood. I wanted our character to have magical powers, and I felt like this would be a good way to make him feel mysterious and somewhat powerful. And after using a variety of games and references, we finally settled on this design. And while there were definitely still quite a few iterations to go, I really liked the mysterious feeling that the hood and robe gave to the character, and I felt that the blank face worked really well with the silent protagonist idea. It was also important that we kept the main character relatively small, since we were still planning for the story to be that you are the son of the king of the underworld. And within the game files, we would even go as far as to always name the main character Lucy. However, this never made it into the final game, since we would later move away from anything related to religion or demons. So with an initial character design picked out, we moved on to the animations. The first two we would need would be both an idle and a run. It didn't take Joey too long to put these animations together. However, while I thought the idle looked pretty good, the run animation definitely wasn't what we wanted to go with in the final game. In fact, I think the run animation traumatized him in a way, because every character going forward we intentionally designed to use a different form of transportation than walking in order to avoid having to animate legs ever again. Regardless if these animations would be final or not, it was time for me to get to work. So I cracked open Unity and wrote the initial code for a character controller. I'm writing some basic code to let the character walk around. Now, I want to use this as an opportunity to remind any game developers watching to always question your parameter values. The movement speed I've selected at this point in development was seemingly random, just what felt right in the moment. However, until we had fully finished our first level, I would be constantly checking and tweaking this value to try and make it feel just right. It's so important that you don't just pick default values and run with it, as this is going to affect every aspect of the game going forward. And what these values are can change a lot depending on the game you're working on. These could be things like acceleration, gravity, jump height, attack damage, health, you get the idea. But anyways, now that the character is able to move, we were ready to move on to combat. When designing the combat system for our game, we initially planned for the player to be able to do 5 different types of actions. And since we knew we wanted to lean into the bullet hell style gameplay, the first thing the player needed to be able to do was consistently shoot out projectiles that would deal small amounts of damage to the enemy. However, in order to give the combat some depth, we initially planned to give the player a melee combo. Ideally, this would encourage the player to get in close and deal some more damage and break up the pacing of the fights. I also imagine that some bosses may have phases where they're only damageable with melee attack in order to give the game some more variety. Next, we wanted to give the player some kind of dodge roll in order to give them a defensive option when they're overwhelmed with projectiles. And finally, we wanted the player to be able to parry certain projectiles back at the boss, similar to how Cuphead allows you to parry anything with the color pink. Additionally, we also wanted to have a special system similar to Cuphead, where if you parried enough projectiles or dealt enough damage, you could unleash either a weak or powerful special attack based on how full your special meter was. However, before I could implement all of these mechanics, I wanted to have something to test them out against. This led to the creation of the mock boss. You see, before we would start designing the first real fight of the game, I wanted to set aside some time and create sort of a dummy fight that would help me get a good feel for what kind of mechanics work well and which ones don't. In order to save some time, the arena was made of assets from previous projects, and the boss itself would be a character named Omnitrip from a fighting game I had worked on in the past. So with all these assets ready, I gave the player the ability to shoot and dash, and I put together a boss with a couple basic attack patterns. And from this, I could start to get an understanding for how the game would play, and I could also start to get a feel for what kind of attack patterns felt good. Additionally, I would also start to pick out names for the different types of attack patterns that would be used throughout development. For example, a string of bullets one after the other would be referred to as a volley from this point on, and multiple bullets being fired at the same time would be referred to as a multi. Interestingly, it's actually these two patterns that make up the majority of attacks in Infernal Elements. By simply combining the multi and volley together, and usually introducing some kind of offset to the angle of the bullets, I could create a very wide amount of attack patterns while only using a very small amount of code. And while each boss would certainly have a wide variety of unique attacks that had their own art and sound effects, the consistent use of these projectile attacks would help us keep the bullet hell feel that the game is aiming for, while also allowing for quicker development. But anyways, moving on to the second iteration of the mock boss fight, a variety of changes would be made, such as redesigning the bullets to be color-coded based on the element they represent, and giving the boss a functional health bar that would allow him to transition to a second phase where he would use a new variety of attacks. It was also at this time that Joey would redesign the walk animation to be more of a magical glide rather than the walking he was doing originally. You may also notice that the mock boss in a second phase also moves towards the player, and while no boss in the final game has a movement pattern quite like this, I did notice that if he ever were to press you against a wall, you could pretty easily pop out the other side. So while I've never been able to do it myself, I've always theorized that it's possible for a speedrunner to use a boss to clip out of bounds and reach the ending collider, skipping the entire fight. And now, moving on to the final iteration of the mock boss fight, we would make a few changes to help it resemble the final game a little closer. For example, we made the arena much darker, allowing the advanced lighting on the bullets to shine a little brighter, as well as redesigning the bullets themselves to have a white inner part, which would actually resemble the bullets that enter the gungeon a lot more closely. In addition, we would also redesign the player's dash animation here in order to make his eyes disappear and slim him down, giving a bit more of an aerodynamic feel. You'll probably also notice that there's a glowing pentagram in the middle of the arena. This was an animation that Joey threw together because he thought it looked pretty cool, but we hadn't fully figured out where it would be used. The plan we'd eventually come up with was that these would be the teleporters to take you from arena to arena. However, as we moved away from religious elements later, this would eventually get scrapped. And with that, I felt comfortable enough with the mock boss that we could finally move on and design the first real fight. Ready to move on to our first real boss fight, we had to decide which element to start with. We began by listing out a handful of elements along with a few potential design features that would make sense for them, things like gender and size that we thought worked well with each of the elements. The initial list we would come up with consisted of the following 7 elements. In addition to this list, there were a couple other random features we had written down that would end up making it to the final game, like the electric boss being a mostly gentle character with a focus on magic, and the rock boss being a very small but agile fighter. And while we weren't sure what order we wanted these elements to appear in, we were initially planning for the game to have 8 boss fights. However, as we started developing some of these fights, we realized that they took a lot longer than we had anticipated, and we ended up cutting a few elements. Those of you paying close attention may have noticed that the fire boss is missing from this list, and the reason for that is pretty simple. As I've said before, the story at this point was still that the old king had grown very weak and you were the new fire elemental trying to keep fire's control of the underworld. With this story in place, there was no need for you to ever fight the old fire elemental, meaning we didn't include him as a potential boss fight. So with this list in place, how do we decide which one to start with? Well, as I think many would be surprised by, we actually decided to start with one of the bosses that would appear towards the middle of the game. See, we figured that the first boss we worked on would probably have lower quality as we were still figuring things out. Because of this, the element that we thought made the most sense to start with would be the electric elemental. And I know this may come as a shock to some of you, as in the final game, the electric elemental is actually the first boss you fight. However, at this point in development, I felt that the electric elemental having this gentle nature would actually be a pretty good way to spice things up towards the middle, as most of the other elementals would have a pretty aggressive tone. Having finally settled on an element, it was time to work on the design. And after a short brainstorming session, the first kind of design we wanted to go for was a bit of a fallen angel. We felt that this would work well with the gentle nature of the character, while also sticking to the sort of demonic tones that we wanted all the characters to have. Moving forward with this idea, the first thing we did was grab a similar looking image online to what I just described, and tried tweaking it to sort of fit our elements. And while I do think this first iteration looks really cool, it's nowhere near the art style that we would be able to continuously pump out. However, it gave us a really good reference to move forward with. And with that, Joey would create the first sprite that would eventually become the electric elemental. And while this sprite was still in the same art style as our original player, there are a few things I wanted changed. To start, I thought that the wings were a little too simple, especially only having a solid color on the inside. To try and fix this, I suggested we base our design off bat wings with the way they have bones coming through the middle. Additionally, if we changed it to make it look like the wings were curled up a little bit, it would be easier to later animate them to have a bit of a flapping effect. Additionally, I wasn't a big fan of the way her lower half was just a sort of spectral mist. I felt that it kept the design a little too basic, and if we replaced it with some more traditional legs, we could add some more color and make the design pop a little better. And after a few more iterations, we would finally arrive at this design. And while I don't want to bore you by going over exactly how every single character design or animation was made, I want to try and give you an idea for at least how one of these would come together. See, I would typically say something like, "Hey Joey, can we try and give the character a staff?" And he would eventually respond with something like this. From there, I would take either the original art or the one he just sent me, draw something on top of it and say, "Can we try and make it look more like this?" Which he would usually respond with another image. And from there, we would go step by step with me sending him back examples of what I'm looking for, him tweaking the art, until we would arrive at a final image. And while this process was very effective at getting me the exact art I was looking for, it was very lengthy and took a lot of time away from development. Hopefully in future projects, Joey won't need to reach out to me as often for help, and I can be a little more trusting that he'll produce the sprites we need without me getting involved as often. So now, with the design ready, I was able to put it in game and we could start to get a feel for how big the boss would be. See, while most modern game engines will allow you to put your sprite in game and scale it manually just using the normal tool, it's important that the sprite work fits without any adjustments, since if you start to use the scale tool, the individual pixels won't be the same size, leading to a weird and unprofessional look. But anyways, now that the first boss is in game, I want to take a step back and tell you how we came to a decision on her combat. See, an idea we had early on was to try and make sure that every single fight would interact with the arena in some way. And while some of the later fights do this in certain ways, the electric boss is definitely the one where this is most prevalent. Sticking to the idea that she would use mostly electric based attacks, we thought it'd be cool if there was a grid of 9 panels underneath your feet the whole fight that she would sometimes light up using certain electric shocks. I had even considered making more panels rise up around the edge of the arena as the fight goes on to try and give it a bigger scale, but eventually I realized that was a little ambitious and we cut back to just keeping the arena the same size the whole way through. And once I was happy with the grid attack, I moved on to programming the next custom attack she'd use, which is her dash attack, where she'd fly across the arena trying to hit the player. The reason I wanted to add this attack in was because early on I was really worried about the bosses feeling too static. See, even when she's just standing idle, she floats left to right trying to get towards the player, and I felt that the dash would be a good way to break up her positioning. However, as we get to later bosses, I didn't necessarily follow this philosophy, and when we did have really quick bosses, it actually could cause a little bit of player frustration. We'll get to you later. For anyone wondering, the electric boss does just teleport to the sides of the arena before the dash, and if you look closely, you can see the camera has special logic for when the bosses go away to lock back onto the player, and then reattach to the boss when they come back. So now that we had a bit of gameplay ready, and we knew things weren't going to change too much from here, we were ready to move on to making some of the environmental art. The first piece we wanted to work on were the electric panels that would light up underneath the player's feet. So imagining all the bosses as demons, we thought it'd be cool if the initial panels had runes engraved to them, implying it was some kind of magic that made them light up with lightning. And after a quick conversation, Jody would send me the first iteration of the electric panels. However, I was afraid that this first design was too simple and felt really flat looking, and I also felt that the runes being used felt more Nordic than demonic. And based on these comments, Jody would redesign the panels to look like this. And while I like the general design of this panel a whole lot more, I still have some other issues with it as it no longer fits the art style of our game. However, not wanting to waste any more time, we moved on to the background art. This was a difficult sprite for us to imagine, as the game has this top-down look for the environment, but a side view look for all of the characters. Because of this, we wanted to go for a bit more of an abstract background, kind of like something from Terraria, and while this style would work for us, we'd later realize that not dealing with the issue of our perspective early on would be a big issue going forward, as we never really solved it, leading to a lot of inconsistencies throughout the game. This is most notable when looking at the sides of our arenas, as there's no blending from the top to the side, and it gives off this really sharp and ugly look to it. When moving on to later projects, I want to make a big effort to establish a perspective early on. Since the release of Infernal Elements, I've even put a lot of time into trying to work on 2.5D games in order to try and take that pressure off the artist and instead use the game engine to handle our perspective. Coming back to Unity, I would implement these art assets, and for the first time, we would start to get a feel for what the final game could look like. However, now that I could see it in game for the first time, the art of the electric panels really stood out to me against the background and the characters, so our first attempt to fix it would be changing the colors to something a little softer and more of a green tone. But enough about the art, it was time for me to move on and start making more attacks for the boss. And the first one I wanted to work on was replacing that really boring volley of projectiles with something a little more interesting. And while I'm not sure it's something most players would notice in the end, one thing I really wanted to do in making the boss attack patterns was to try to give each of the bosses a sort of theme to their projectiles. See, the rock boss would always use sweeping motions for his attacks, the poison boss always throws out clumps of projectiles, and the ice boss always uses a bit of randomness to each of his attacks. For the electric boss, I wanted to go with this consistent interleaved pattern of bullets. Knowing that she'd be one of our longer range bosses floating off the edge of the arena, I felt that this pattern would be really good for trying to flood the entire arena with bullets without being too overwhelming. Afterwards, I would move on to making Phase 2. Now, I mentioned earlier I wanted bosses to move around so they wouldn't feel so static, and because of that, I decided it'd be best if she moved to the sides of the arena after transitioning out of Phase 1. But to make the movement a little more seamless, I thought it'd be best if she always started Phase 2 using a dash attack. One point I want to bring up is how early on I had a really big focus on making sure each of the phases had the same or similar difficulty levels. Knowing that our fights weren't going to have any checkpoints, I was really worried that making the fights progressively harder would cause people to give up, as by the time they got to see new content, they would lose so quickly they wouldn't be able to adapt to it. My thought was that keeping each of the phases at a similar difficulty would cause the player to learn and master each of the phases in a similar number of attempts. So while the implementation wasn't perfect, and many of the bosses do trend to be a little bit more difficult in their third phase, watching playtesters go through the game later on, I was able to see that they would die a few times in the first phase, but then they'd eventually master it, and then go on to do the same in the second and third phases. Back to the Phase 2 dash attack, I would later realize that just making it vertical definitely wasn't enough to make it stand out or feel unique, so we would add some trailing lightning that would strike as she flew by, making this one of the only attacks in the game that is a direct upgrade from a previous phase attack. Now that we started working on the boss's second phase, it became important to help the player know where they were in the fight. This led to the discussion about the health bar. And while you may think that making a health bar is as simple as just putting it on screen somewhere and calling it a day, there were a lot of decisions that had to be made. We had to decide where on screen your health bar should go, where should the enemy's health bar go, how big should they be, what colors should they use, and so on. Eventually, after looking at a lot of other projects and references from online, we decided that each health bar should be themed after the element it represents, using not only the colors, but an icon to indicate that element. I also really wanted to animate the health bar, having particles floating around that indicate the element further, but due to limitations with Unity, this would be something that would be revisited later. The final design would end up looking like this. We thought that the large circle to keep the icon in would work well with any theme we wanted to go with, and we ended up including 4 additional fireballs underneath the bar itself, which would indicate how far along you were at charging your special. And while this first design would later get scrapped, one interesting note is that the fireballs used to indicate your special charge would actually get used as a particle effect to indicate when you had your special ready later. But now, with the design out of the way, we would go ahead and put in Unity and set up the code. One fun fact is that this is one of the very few pieces of code that Joey would write for the game. However, as you may be able to see, it's not in the right spot. And that's because during development we almost never played the game in full screen mode. We pretty much always had it in this smaller window that is used during development. Because of this, it wouldn't be until a little while later that we actually noticed this issue and correct it, so just bear with me as it stays there for a while. Moving on, I wanted to create another attack pattern that would be reusable from boss to boss. This would help the game feel more coherent while also limiting the amount of programming needed to be done. To achieve this goal, I took some inspiration from Fury and implemented a wide-range melee attack that would consist of an indicator followed by a large sweeping motion. And while the implementation of this kind of attack was pretty simple, getting the visuals right for it was a pretty complicated task, so I would come back to it later. At this point, we had spent over a month developing the game, and I had spent over 2 weeks of it looking at this ugly floor pattern that didn't match the characters of the rest of the game. Because of this, I decided it was time that we gave this arena a little makeover. So I finally convinced Joey that we needed to make a new ground pattern from scratch, whether he liked it or not. After a while, he would get back to me with this design, and I'm really glad we remade it because this pattern would end up being a reference for much of the environment art going forward. To go along with this, I had thought of a couple ways I could write some code to give the environment a little bit more depth and remove that very flat feeling it had in previous iterations. To start, I gave the background a parallaxing effect, which, if you don't know, is when the background moves with the camera a little bit to give an illusion that it's really far away. Next, I would make a shader based on a noise map that would emulate fog shuffling around in the background. So while creating and implementing these two effects was a pretty simple process, I think they do a really good job of separating the foreground from the background and giving the illusion that you're pretty high up. We would also use this time as a chance to implement the first iteration of the bridge you'd use to enter the arena. However, this would be pretty quickly replaced with a slightly more detailed version in the next update. But the visual improvements don't stop just there. We went back to the beginning of the fight and I gave the boss a proper intro to make it feel really grand. Although when we later reworked the UI and removed the boss's name, that part would get scrapped from the intro as well. Additionally, the flashing white light you see that happens when the boss first spawns in would also get removed to try and keep it more in line with later bosses who wouldn't have such effects. Looking back, I think we probably could have kept the white flash for the electric boss and probably tried to add something to other bosses to bring them up in quality rather than taking the electric boss a step down to match everything else. The final visual improvement we'd add for now would be the melee attack. Still using Fury as a reference, I wanted to try and emulate their expanding rings they use during their warning, but I also wanted to try and keep it pixelated to match our pixel art style. To accomplish this, I created a particle system that would constantly emit pixelated rings that would then scale up over time and were only visible within a layer mask. At the time, I thought this did an okay job of recreating the effect Fury had, but even back then I knew something wasn't right because I was breaking the rule about scaling pixel art and creating mismatched pixel sizes. Happy with the visual improvements for now, it was time to move on to the boss's third and final combat phase. By this point, most bosses have already introduced all of their mechanics, so it's just a matter of finding new ways to introduce them and challenge the player. For the electric boss, this meant a wider ranged melee attack that would give the player more time to dodge, and another projectile attack that would use that inner leaves pattern I talked about earlier. To round out the third phase, we decided to go with one more lightning based attack that would strike in two consistent patterns. However, as we later discovered during playtesting, people would get really caught off guard when the lightning would strike directly where they're standing, so you'd actually change this attack to always start on whichever pattern you're not going to get hit by initially, and then alternate to the other. So while none of the attacks in Phase 3 were particularly difficult to program and put together, at this point it would take multiple minutes just to get to that phase to test every single change I made. That is, if it wasn't for the fact that we had set up some dev tools. See, pretty early on, I'd given myself the ability to click a couple buttons before running the game to give myself either infinite health or infinite damage. This would mean that I could skip from phase to phase pretty quickly, saving myself countless hours of development. Unfortunately, even though I think these dev tools were the only reason this game was ever able to be completed in the first place, I also think it's one of the areas that I messed up the most during Infernal Elements. And what I mean by that is I could have given myself even better tools. Looking back, it was pretty stupid to set up a dev tool that I could only change before starting the game rather than something I could toggle on and off at the click of a single button. And also, only having the ability to either be invincible or kill the boss instantly was not the best for testing because I often wanted to check what happened when I dealt damage to a boss or took damage at certain times. Giving myself some tools that would also allow me to heal the player or boss would have gone a long way in speeding up testing. And finally, the biggest mistake I made was making the dev tools level dependent. What I should have done was made a prefab or scriptable objects that would hold my dev tools so that I could toggle them on and off all in one place. Instead, anytime I wanted to build the game, I'd have to go level by level, verifying that the dev tools were turned off. So for any game devs watching, if you're only going to take one thing away from this video, let it be to make really dynamic and easy to use testing tools. Moving on from my rant, it was at this time that I decided I was ready to flesh out the player's moveset. You may recall that one of the things I wanted the player to be able to do were some long melee combos. However, due to the projectile heavy nature of the boss, it was very difficult to stay near them for long periods of time, so we decided to cut this idea. So with that out of the way, the only thing we were left with was the parry and special attacks. Parry itself was pretty simple, as I just set up a circle that the player could spawn in that would redirect any bullets back at the boss and change who they're affiliated with. Then I quickly added some logic to make sure that only a few of the bullets would become pink and be allowed to be parried, and we were done. At least, that's what I thought at the time. What I later realized was that many of these pink bullets would end up spawning towards the edge of attacks and be almost impossible to redirect at the boss. Because of this, there would need to be a lot of custom logic implemented on many of the attacks throughout the game to only allow parryable bullets to spawn within certain areas. And looking back, I probably should have done this to even more attacks in the game, as many of the ones that spawn bullets in all directions can potentially spawn the reflectable bullets on the other side, meaning the player wouldn't have an opportunity to go for a parry. And with that out of the way, we were ready to move on to the special attack. From the very beginning, I knew that I wanted this to have some kind of healing property, as in many other boss rush games I noticed that if a player took a hit early on, they'd often just reset the fight, and I thought that this would make for a good comeback mechanic. Next, I wanted to recreate Cuphead's weak and super version of the special attack, as I kinda liked the idea of giving the player choice, and I thought it would make for different playstyles. I figured that the weak version could shoot out a projectile that would do pretty good damage, and then the super version would be much more cinematic, kinda like the super from some fighting games, and would do a lot more damage in addition to healing the player. But after coding the system up and trying it out for myself, I had some gripes with how it was playing. To start, it was almost never worth it to use the weak version of your special attack, knowing that saving up would just be a better reward. The second issue came from the fact that I let the player build their special meter through both normal damage and parrying, meaning that taking the risk of going for a parry never really felt worth it, as you could just play it safe and wait for your meter to build up through normal damage. Third was the fact that the slow buildup of the special attack meant that they never really had it ready during the early phases of the fight, leading to them always unleashing it towards the start of the third phase. This meant that the third phase would take a huge chunk of damage and become arbitrarily easier, which would make balancing the game a lot harder. The fourth and final issue is that the special attack had no impact on the way the player played the game. Due to the really long build-up to get the special attack, I was worried that the player missing it would have too much of an impact on the fight. Because of this, I decided to make it a heat-seeking missile that would always hit the boss no matter what. But the downside to this decision was that the player no longer had to think about when or where to use it. They could just wait until it was ready and unleash it right away every time. It was for these reasons that later iterations of the special attack would only have one version rather than a weak and super version. The special meter would be removed in favor of a fireball that could only be filled up through a single parry, and the attack itself would be reworked into a quick and seamless burst of fire that could only be used at short range. So in the end, even though it's not as flashy, I'm much happier with the final version of the special attack we went with, since it encourages them to take risks in order to get the parry off, and then requires them to weave in and out of the boss's range in order to activate the special attack, which leads to much more dynamic and interesting fights. And now finally, after completing all 3 combat phases and fleshing out the player's moveset, the only thing left to do was decide how to end the fight. But like everything else in the project so far, this question wasn't so easy to answer. Because while most other games would simply be content to just say that once the boss's health bar hits 0, the player has won and the fight's over, I thought that we could do better. Referencing Fury one last time, I really liked the way they ended most of their fights with an endurance section, a phase where the boss would become invincible and the player would have to survive an onslaught of bullet attacks. However, I wanted to take this one step further. I wanted the finale to be a complete tone shift from the rest of the fight, a fast and relentless series of attacks that would challenge the player on all the mechanics they learned during the first 3 phases. But just as important was to make sure that this grand finale was a true spectacle. This meant using grand, overwhelming attacks that demonstrated the boss's power. That way when the player overcame these fights, it'd be even more memorable and satisfying. However, I want to clarify that this doesn't mean making every attack difficult. In fact, I intentionally made sure to sprinkle in at least a couple attacks during each boss's finale that were visually super intense, but weren't actually that difficult to avoid. That way I could be a little more confident that players would eventually beat these bosses without taking away the satisfaction that comes from overcoming a challenge. One example of this is at the end of the electric boss's finale, I decided to make them use the lightning strike attack, but at a much higher rate than usual. This way there was constant bolts coming down and sound effects blaring in the player's ear, causing them to frantically dash around the arena as fast as they could. However, since the panels under your feet would only light up at a specific rate, this attack wasn't any more difficult than the one you would have seen in the very first phase. But despite this attack panicked our playtesters so much that many of them would dash until sticky keys would kick in, which was the only time playtesters would get hit by that attack. But when the boss's finale came to an end, the fight was truly over. And we had an idea from early on in development that once the fight got to this point, the player would get the satisfaction of casting an over-the-top, flashy execution spell that would burn the boss to ashes. However, due to issues with the art, uncertainties with the story, and most importantly just constraints with time, we ended up having to forego this idea and instead just let the bosses burn away on their own. And when I play the game back today, these deaths feel really anticlimactic to me and just overall lame. But at the time, I couldn't justify spending a few days to create that grand execution, as it would have meant taking a few days away from balancing and polishing the fights, which just wasn't something I was willing to compromise on. Speaking of polish, one of the last things we had to do was add some audio. To save on time, most of our sound effects would come from websites that would provide them for free. However, I would still bring them up in Audacity and modify and combine them so much that by the end they were almost never recognizable. And for the music, we planned to use a set of heavy metal tracks we found online that didn't require a license to use. But after many months of listening to these tracks on loop as we continued to develop the game, I decided that they were just too generic and didn't do a very good job of actually setting each boss apart. But luckily, about halfway through the project's development, I came into contact with a composer named Nathan. And even though he joined the project quite late, he wasted no time getting to work and composing unique songs for each of the game's bosses. But just like with the game's art, I was still pretty strict with what I would use, often requiring changes or adjustments to the music he'd send me, sometimes even requiring songs get restarted from scratch. One example of this is actually the Electric Boss's theme, which was originally much more inspired by classical music. But not wanting our first boss theme to be a remix of something else, I asked that it get reworked and we ended up with this. So while if you listen closely, you can still hear some references to classical music throughout the Electric Boss's song, I think these adjustments help it stand on its own 2 feet as something unique. A more extreme example of an adjustment was during the Poison Boss, where the very first draft was more focused on his silly side and sounded like this. However, worrying that the song wasn't quite the intensity we wanted, we rewrote it from scratch to focus more on his brutish side, which sounded like this. And after making incredible songs for each of the game's bosses, he wouldn't stop there. Nathan would go on to make unique music for the title screen, the game's ending, story sections, and even each of the encounters that happens in between every boss fight. So if you're interested in hearing more of the Infernal Elements soundtrack, all of it can be found on YouTube, Spotify, or Steam. These contain not only the original songs you can hear during normal gameplay, but extended versions you can't normally hear, along with some unused songs that we couldn't find a place for. Revenue from any of these sources will go directly to supporting Nathan, so again, if you're interested, please check them out. Truthfully, I could go on for countless hours about everything that went into making these bosses. In this video, I focused on the development of the electric boss, but you can imagine everything I've talked about and apply that to the 5 other bosses. Every single one of them had countless iterations of early terrible designs, unused attacks, and bugs that needed to be fixed. But even if I did decide to ramble on for countless hours about those things, that would only cover the boss fights. I haven't even mentioned the game's encounters, long survival sections that take place on the way to each boss that highlight and teach you about each of the upcoming mechanics that you'll need to know when you get there. There's also the constant story comics and character dialogue, which try to add to the world building and give each character some personality. And there's even lesser used features like local multiplayer where up to 4 people can play through the game together, which required custom respawn logic and boss targeting AI. Not to mention Infernal difficulty, which was added a few weeks after launch, giving the game a new difficulty that would rework every single attack in the game to make it harder, and looking at the Steam achievement, to this day, I can see only 5 people have managed to beat it. And that's right, we added Steam achievements to the game, along with everything else Steam requires if you want to publish your game. And even after all that, I still have a seemingly endless list of everything it took to make Infernal Elements. And the one thing that everything I've talked about has in common is that it takes time. Everything I've shown you today went through a series of planning, whiteboarding, designing, and coding before it could be implemented and shown off. And this process can take days or even weeks. Which I hope answers the question in the title of this video. Because to make a game with the content I wanted at the quality I desired, that was just how long I needed. But I'm not a perfect developer. None of us on the project are. We all do this on the side knowing that we're not going to make a meaningful amount of money. And I know there were plenty of days or even weeks during the project where I'd try to set up tools that would fail to be useful, or I'd try implementing ideas that wouldn't make it into the final game, and there were weeks where I'd get distracted working on unrelated projects, or sometimes a new game would come out and I'd play that instead of working for a while. But I think that's okay, because for me those are all requirements in the game development process. It was taking breaks and stepping away that would really get me motivated to come back and make good progress. So to any game developers watching, whether you're experienced and already working on a large project, new and just sitting on an idea, or perhaps to myself in the future, my last piece of advice is that it's okay to take breaks, step away, and come back to the project stronger. But it's not okay to let those breaks turn into procrastination, because as an indie developer, the only time your project truly fails is when you stop working on it. So with that said, I'll wrap things up here because I gotta get back to work on my next project. If you're interested in seeing any updates on future projects from me, feel free to subscribe, or if there's anything else you want to see related to Infernal Elements, feel free to say so in the comments below. But for now, that's everything, and I'll see you later.